Welcome to the Chase Challenge Week 32. Last week, we talked about King Josiah, and it may have seemed like during that period of time that Judah was actually starting to listen to the warning of the prophets. Maybe the ministry of the prophets was effective. Josiah's reforms were greater and more far-reaching than any of the kings of Judah. We will see that Josiah's spiritual reformations were short-lived, and his sons quickly went back to the ways of the kings before. Now, what is the political climate of the land surrounding Judah at this time? Neo-Babylonia is starting to rise in power. Assyria is weakening, and Egypt is coming to help the weakened Assyrians survive against the up-and-coming Babylonians. Last week's reading ends with the Egyptian king Necho traveling through Israelite territory to help the Assyrians against the Babylonians, and he is confronted by Josiah. Josiah confronts King Necho and ends up getting killed. Well, if you will turn your attention to these charts behind me, I will tell you about the next 23 years after Josiah's death. With the death of Josiah, I want to show you that he had at least 4 sons that we know of: Johanan, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah, and Jehoahaz. When Josiah was killed, the common people made Josiah's youngest son, Jehoahaz, the king of Judah. This was very short-lived. He was only on the throne for about 3 months before Necho, the Egyptian king, comes in, takes Jehoahaz off the throne. He deports him to Egypt, and Jehoahaz is prisoner in Egypt there until he dies. Necho sets up Jehoiakim to be the next king over Judah under his authority. Necho demands a massive amount of tribute money, and Jehoiakim may stay on the throne under his authority and protection as long as Jehoiakim continues to pay that tribute money. Now, Jehoiakim does pay the tribute for a period of time, but eventually rebels. After 11 years, Jehoiakim's reign comes to an end, and his son, Jehoiachin, becomes the king. So this is now the grandson of Josiah who becomes king, and he only rules for 3 months because during this time, Nebuchadnezzar invades Jerusalem and Jehoiachin surrenders to him. Along with Jehoiachin, Nebuchadnezzar takes over 3,000 nobles and royalty with him to Babylon, and Jehoiachin remains in Babylon in prison for 37 years. But then when Nebuchadnezzar's successor comes into power, he releases Jehoiachin and treats him like royalty. He eats at the king's table every night, and that king actually pays him money. So he lives well in the land of Babylon until his death. When Jehoiachin surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar brought him and the 3,000 other nobles to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar set up Josiah's 3rd son as the so-called king over Judah under his authority. Zedekiah would be a vassal to Babylon, paying tribute, just doing what the king of Babylon wanted him to do. We'll talk more about Zedekiah's fate in week 33 and 34. Just keep in mind that these three kings are sons of Josiah, and Jehoiachin is a grandson who survives in Babylon. That's very important to note as we continue with the chronological story. Now, God continues to speak to each one of Josiah's sons through the prophet Jeremiah, even though they're not listening. Jeremiah kept prophesying. He kept warning. He kept getting visions and telling them the future, what was going to happen, warning of future judgment, warning them about Babylon. But Josiah's sons not only ignored what Jeremiah had to say, but they embraced injustice. They didn't just tolerate injustice, they embraced it. These guys, these sons of Josiah, were victimizers. And the cries of the victims reached the ears of God. And as you're reading this week, I want you to put yourself in the place of the victim. I want you to hear what Habakkuk and Jeremiah are both saying as they cry out to God for justice. They're surrounded by these kings who are killing innocent people. Innocent people are dying. Remember Manasseh, Josiah's grandfather? He was killing his own children through human sacrifice. God cannot tolerate injustice, and he has a heart for the victim. He is an avenger to the victim. And this week is all about Habakkuk and Joel and Jeremiah crying out to God to bring justice and to avenge the victim. This week's reading isn't just about justice being brought to Josiah's sons and all the other injustices that were being done in that day. No, this week's reading is about justice that will come one day to take care of the injustice that's happening in our world today. The book of Joel. The book of Joel is all about the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord that is coming in our future when God, the perfect judge, the perfect righteous king, comes and brings justice and avenges the victim once and for all. Here are my questions for this week's reading. Number 1, Jeremiah is very honest with God. I fall in love with Jeremiah every time I read through his books, Jeremiah and Lamentations. And I hope that you will too. But just hear Jeremiah's honesty and his heart as he talks to God through this crisis. He has a very important mission, a mission that began when he was just a teenager. But he feels entirely unqualified for this mission, for this purpose that God has given him. Look and find out, why does Jeremiah feel unqualified for what God has told him to do? God cannot tolerate injustice, but he has been putting off judgment for so long. What does Jeremiah say is the alternative to judgment? And can justice be served without judgment? What is God's ultimate desire after the judgment occurs? At one point, Jeremiah stands in the middle of the temple courtyard and he cries out to the people to correct their ways, and God will let them live in the land. What are the things that God says through Jeremiah needs to be corrected? What are those injustices that need to be made right? What does justice look like in God's eyes? After Josiah's death, the prophets must have felt like their purpose was worthless, like what they were doing and getting up every day, their job per se, had no reward. Nobody was listening. No one was heeding what they were saying. And Jeremiah was doing this for years. And there was no result. There were no thumbs up on the YouTube channel. He just kept on going, and it got discouraging. He felt like it was worthless. Was Jeremiah's mission futile? How does God encourage Jeremiah when Jeremiah is honest about how he feels about what God has told him to do and the response of the people? Ironically, shortly after Jeremiah is honest with God about how he feels like his mission is so worthless, he begins calling out to the Israelites about how their pursuits are worthless and what they're doing and pursuing and chasing after is worthless. It leads me to ask, what determines the worth of a pursuit? What gives how we spend our time, our money, our brain space? What gives it value? Jeremiah continues to be faithful in God's calling, but the people don't like it. They're not just trying to ignore it, they're planning on killing Jeremiah. There is a plot out there to end his life. God tells Jeremiah what's going to happen. He cries out to God for justice. He cries out to God for vengeance. But then, a couple chapters later, he's crying out to God for mercy for these same people. He's crying out to God to show compassion. What is that perfect balance between compassion and mercy and justice and judgment? Do you and I possess it? Does God? How does God communicate to Jeremiah that he alone has that perfect balance between when to show mercy and compassion and when to bring judgment, to bring justice to a situation? Jeremiah ends this week's reading with a testimony about who God is to him during this crazy time, this crazy time in Judah's history when everything is in upheaval. He's personally experiencing rejection, loneliness, a task that is just too difficult for him to do. And he's in the middle of a city, a kingdom that deserves God's judgment. And he knows what's going to happen. He knows that it's coming and it's impending. But who is God to Jeremiah in the middle of the crazy? Listen, these last few weeks in our country have been a crazy time. We are just getting through a worldwide pandemic. There is definitely injustice in our country, in our world. As we read this week, God will speak to our hearts and remind us that he does not tolerate injustice. He has a heart for the victim, and he will avenge the victim. He will bring justice and judgment to the victimizer. But when he does, we don't need to be afraid because he is our refuge. He is our strength. He provides a way to experience peace, tranquility, safety, and even joy in the midst of the crazy. And we're gonna see more about this within the next couple of weeks. So keep chasing. Don't stop now. It's too relevant. And I'll see you next week.